An old firefighter walked into a small-town animal clinic carrying two Labrador puppies he desperately wanted to give away. But the moment one tiny puppy pressed against his leg and refused to leave him, everyone in the room realized this story was never really about dogs. His wife was slowly losing her memories. The war inside his mind never truly ended. And somewhere beneath the silence of that frozen winter, a broken man was quietly running out of reasons to keep going. Sometimes God sends miracles in strange ways. Sometimes they arrive on four small paws. Cold wind rolled across the snow-covered roads of Pine Ridge, Wyoming, while dark clouds buried the mountains beneath a sky that looked too tired to snow and too heavy to clear. Walter Hayes had once been the kind of man people trusted during emergencies. At 74 years old, he still carried the broad shoulders of a firefighter, though age and grief had bent them slightly forward over time. His thick gray beard remained uneven from careless trimming, and deep burn scars disappeared beneath the collar of his old canvas coat whenever he turned his head too quickly. Years ago, children in Chicago used to wave at him when Engine 14 rolled through the streets. Now strangers mostly stepped aside because Walter carried the exhausted silence of a man who had survived too many funerals. Beside him walked Margaret Hayes, his wife of 48 years. Margaret was small and slender, wrapped in a pale blue knitted scarf that nearly swallowed her narrow frame. Her silver hair rested softly against her shoulders in loose waves, and her faded green eyes still carried warmth despite the confusion that had begun quietly stealing pieces of her memory. There was something heartbreakingly gentle about her face, the kind of softness only certain women carried after spending most of their lives loving broken people without asking for anything in return. In Margaret's trembling arms rested two black Labrador puppies no older than 11 weeks. Their names were Ash and Bear. Ash was slightly smaller, with unusually bright hazel eyes and a tiny white patch beneath his chin that looked painted there by accident. Bear was larger and calmer, his thick black fur glossy beneath the fluorescent lights, though he became strangely nervous whenever Walter moved too suddenly nearby. The automatic doors of Pine Ridge Veterinary Clinic slid open with a weak mechanical groan. Warm air carrying the smells of antiseptic, wet fur, coffee, and cedarwood drifted toward them. Behind the reception desk sat Claire Donovan. At 29 years old, Claire looked permanently exhausted in the way animal rescue workers often did. Her auburn hair was tied into a messy ponytail that had partially collapsed during the day, loose strands hanging around pale freckled cheeks. She wore dark green scrubs beneath an oversized gray cardigan, and faint purple shadows rested beneath observant brown eyes that missed very little. Claire had spent years treating injured animals abandoned by people who promised they would never leave them behind. That history had quietly made her suspicious of sadness. The moment she looked up and saw Walter and Margaret standing there with the puppies, something inside her tightened. Not because they looked dangerous, because they looked desperate. Margaret approached the counter slowly while Bear shifted nervously in her arms. Walter remained farther behind near the waiting chairs, his posture rigid despite the stiffness in his knees. Claire noticed immediately that he scanned the exits before looking at people. Military habit, or firefighter instinct. Either way, men only carried that kind of awareness after witnessing things that permanently changed them. "Can I help you folks?" Claire asked gently. Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but emotion reached her throat first. She swallowed hard and lowered her eyes toward the puppies. "We were wondering," she whispered softly, "if maybe someone here knows families who might want dogs." Claire's smile faded carefully. "You're giving them away?" Walter answered before Margaret could. "Yes." His voice sounded rough, not cruel, but painfully final. The kind of voice built from smoke, sleepless nights, and years spent holding emotions beneath the surface because other people needed you to stay calm. Claire glanced between them again. Nothing about this felt normal. The puppies were healthy, clean, recently groomed, expensive collars around their necks. Loved animals did not usually end up surrendered inside small-town clinics unless something far worse existed underneath the story. Ash suddenly licked Margaret's trembling fingers. Margaret nearly broke apart at the gesture. Walter looked away immediately. That detail stayed with Claire. People avoided eye contact when hiding shame. But Walter avoided tenderness itself, like even witnessing affection hurt him somehow. The front door opened again behind them. Cold air rushed inside alongside a tall man wearing a dark brown military jacket dusted with snow. A large German shepherd moved silently beside him without pulling the leash once. The man looked around 38 years old, athletic but lean in the way soldiers often became after years of deployment. His dark blonde hair was cropped short, and a faded scar crossed the edge of his jawline beneath light stubble. Calm gray eyes scanned the room with quiet discipline before settling briefly on Walter. His name was Noah Brooks, and the German shepherd beside him was Rex, a retired military working dog nearly 9 years old. Gray fur had begun spreading around Rex's muzzle, but his posture remained sharp, alert, almost intimidating beneath the controlled stillness. The moment Rex noticed the Labrador puppies, he froze. Then slowly, deliberately, the shepherd stepped between Walter and the puppies. Bear immediately whimpered and buried himself tighter against Margaret's chest. The room fell silent. Walter stopped breathing for half a second. Claire noticed it instantly. Noah did too. Rex did not growl. He did not bark. But his amber eyes remained fixed directly on Walter with unsettling focus, as if the old dog sensed something buried deep beneath the firefighter's skin. Walter's scarred hands tightened slightly at his sides. Not anger. Fear. For the first time since entering the clinic, the old firefighter looked like a man standing dangerously close to memories he had spent decades trying to outrun. And suddenly Claire understood something important. These people were not giving the puppies away because they stopped loving them. They were giving them away because life had already started taking things from them one piece at a time. Snow began falling harder as evening swallowed the mountains around Pine Ridge, turning the narrow roads into pale ribbons beneath Noah Brooks' headlights. The farther he drove behind Walter Hayes' rusted pickup truck, the more isolated the world became. Gas stations disappeared first, then houses. Then even the power lines vanished into the storm until only dark forests and snow remained beneath the Wyoming sky. Rex sat silently in the passenger seat beside Noah, his large scarred body unusually tense tonight. The old German shepherd rarely reacted strongly to strangers anymore. Years of military work had trained discipline so deeply into him that emotion usually stayed buried beneath instinct. But something about Walter unsettled the dog in ways Noah could not ignore. Noah tightened both hands around the steering wheel. He told himself he was only making sure the elderly couple reached home safely during the storm. But deep down, he already knew that was a lie. 20 minutes later, Walter's truck turned onto a narrow dirt road half buried beneath snowdrifts. At the end sat a small cabin leaning slightly beneath the weight of years and winter storms. Weak yellow light flickered through one cracked front window. The place looked exhausted. Old wood siding peeled beneath layers of frozen wind damage. Half the porch railing had collapsed inward, and a blue tarp covered part of the roof, where snow slowly leaked through broken shingles. Beside the cabin rested stacks of chopped firewood already running dangerously low for December. Noah immediately noticed something worse. No smoke from the chimney. No proper heat. Inside the cabin, Margaret carefully dried ash and bare with old towels beside a tiny portable heater that rattled loudly every few seconds. The room smelled faintly of damp wood, canned soup, wet fur, and burnt coffee. Despite the poverty surrounding them, the cabin remained surprisingly clean. Not because life was organized, but because they owned very little left to clutter it. Walter removed his coat slowly near the door. His movements looked stiff tonight, not only from age. His right shoulder visibly dragged lower than the left, old injury damage Noah recognized immediately. Men who spent years carrying victims out of burning buildings often paid for it later in silence. Margaret knelt beside Bear with heartbreaking patience, brushing the puppy's black fur carefully while whispering soft nonsense meant only to comfort him. But halfway through the sentence, she suddenly stopped. Confusion crossed her face. "Walter," she murmured quietly. "Did I already feed them?" Walter froze for half a second before answering. "Yes, Maggie. About an hour ago." Margaret smiled weakly, embarrassed. "Right. Of course." But Noah noticed something important. Walter never corrected her sharply. He answered too quickly, too gently, like this was no longer unusual. Rex slowly approached Margaret, then lowered himself beside her feet without invitation. Margaret's face softened instantly. "Oh, you beautiful old boy," she whispered. Rex allowed her trembling hand to rest against his neck. Dogs always understood fragile people faster than humans did. Walter watched the scene silently from across the room. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. The heater coughed weakly before shutting off completely. The cabin immediately fell colder. Margaret wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, while Ash whimpered softly near her lap. Walter moved toward the heater without a word and crouched beside it. His large, weathered hands shook slightly while attempting to relight the pilot flame. Noah saw the scars then. Burned scars. Not small ones. Thin white lines stretched across Walter's wrists and disappeared beneath his sleeves like old fire had tried to consume him piece by piece years ago. After several failed attempts, Walter suddenly slammed his fist against the side of the heater hard enough to rattle the metal walls. The sound made Bear yelp. Margaret flinched too. Instant regret crossed Walter's face. Ugly. Fast. Familiar. "I'm sorry," he muttered immediately, though he sounded like a man apologizing for much more than one moment. Noah stepped closer carefully. "Need help?" Walter kept staring at the broken heater. For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally, "You ever smell burning flesh for so long it never leaves your head?" The room went still. Margaret lowered her eyes quietly. Walter laughed once beneath his breath, bitter enough to hurt. "Apartment fire," he whispered. "Chicago, 1989. His jaw tightened visibly. 3 rookies trapped inside after the ceiling collapsed. His fingers curled slowly into fists. "I was captain that night." Noah understood immediately. Survivor's guilt. The deadliest kind. Walter stared toward the heater flame that no longer existed. "I got out," he said softly. "They didn't." Silence settled heavily across the cabin. Outside, snow hammered against the windows while darkness buried the mountains completely. Margaret suddenly reached toward Walter's hand. Not dramatically, just gently, like someone who had spent decades pulling another person back from the edge without ever asking credit for it. Walter's rough fingers tightened around hers instantly. Then Margaret frowned faintly. "What were we talking about again?" The question shattered something invisible inside the room. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Noah looked away out of respect. And beside the dead heater, Ash and Bear curled quietly against Margaret's feet like 2 small pieces of warmth desperately trying to hold a broken family together. Morning arrived without sunlight. Thick gray clouds buried the Wyoming mountains beneath freezing fog, while icy wind clawed against the cabin windows like something trying to get inside. Margaret Hayes stood alone in the kitchen wearing Walter's oversized flannel shirt over her nightgown, staring blankly at the coffee pot for nearly 2 full minutes because she could no longer remember how to turn it on. Behind her, Ash and Bear wrestled clumsily across the worn wooden floor. Their paws had grown noticeably larger already, oversized and awkward the way Labrador puppies always seemed before adulthood finally caught up with them. Ash remained playful and affectionate, constantly nudging Margaret's legs for attention. Bear was quieter, watchful. The puppy followed Walter with strange emotional caution, as though sensing storms inside the old firefighter nobody else could fully see. Margaret finally pressed random buttons on the machine before sighing softly. "I think it's broken again," she whispered. "It's unplugged, Maggie." Walter's voice came from behind her. Margaret startled slightly, embarrassed. "Oh." Walter crossed the room slowly and plugged the machine back into the outlet beneath the counter. Up close in the pale morning light, he looked older than 74. Dark exhaustion hollowed the skin beneath his pale blue eyes, and his thick gray beard no longer fully hid the deep burn scar crawling beneath the left side of his jaw. His large hands trembled more frequently now, especially during mornings after nightmares. And last night had been bad. Noah had heard the shouting from the guest chair near the fireplace around 3 in the morning. Walter screaming names into the darkness, begging invisible men to get out of the building before the roof collapsed. Margaret remembered none of it by sunrise. But Walter did. Every second. Claire Donovan arrived shortly after 9 carrying medical folders beneath one arm and a cardboard tray of coffee balanced carefully in the other. Snow dusted her auburn hair and melted slowly across the shoulders of her dark green winter coat. She looked tired again today, but there was determination behind her brown eyes now too. Claire had spent most of her adult life rescuing injured animals because humans often broke things faster than they fixed them. Yet standing inside this cabin lately felt disturbingly similar. She handed Margaret a cup gently. "Thought you could use something warm." Margaret smiled with genuine gratitude. You're very kind. Then her smile faded slightly. I'm sorry, she asked softly. Have we met before? The silence afterward felt unbearable. Walter looked down immediately. Claire forced herself to smile anyway. A few times now. Margaret nodded awkwardly, clearly ashamed of herself despite not fully understanding why. Later that afternoon, Claire drove Margaret 40 miles through icy mountain roads toward Pine Ridge Neurology Center, while Noah stayed behind at the cabin, helping Walter repair part of the roof before the next storm arrived. The neurologist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Soft piano music drifted quietly through the waiting room, while snow blurred against large windows overlooking frozen pine trees. Dr. Evelyn Mercer greeted them personally. She was a woman in her early 60s with dark skin, short silver curls, and thoughtful eyes sharpened by decades of delivering painful truths gently. Unlike many doctors, Evelyn never rushed her movements. Even her silence felt patient. Margaret liked her immediately. That terrified Claire. The examination lasted nearly 2 hours. Simple memory exercises. Dates. Patterns. Names. At one point, Margaret called Claire Emily 3 separate times despite being corrected gently each occasion. Later, she forgot what season it was entirely and insisted Christmas had already passed years ago. By the end, even Margaret understood something was wrong. Dr. Mercer folded her hands carefully atop the desk. Mrs. Hayes, she said softly, I believe you're showing early signs of Alzheimer's disease. Margaret stared at her quietly. No dramatic reaction came. Just confusion first, then fear, then something much sadder. Relief, as though part of her had already known for a very long time. Back at the cabin, Walter sat outside beneath falling snow sharpening an old fire axe that no longer needed sharpening. Noah leaned against the porch railing nearby, while Rex rested beside the steps watching Ash and Bear tumble through the snow. You know she needs support now, Noah said carefully. Walter nodded once without looking up. I know. You don't have to do this alone. That finally made Walter stop moving. The old firefighter stared out toward the frozen mountains for several long seconds before speaking. I buried my daughter 3 years ago, he whispered roughly. Now my wife's disappearing too. His jaw tightened painfully. Tell me exactly what part of this sounds survivable. Noah said nothing, because there was no good answer. Walter looked toward Ash and Bear playing near the trees. Snow covered their tiny black coats while they chased each other through drifts with innocent joy neither understood yet. They deserve better than this place, Walter muttered quietly. Better than watching us fall apart. That evening, Walter loaded the puppies' food bowls slowly while Margaret sat silently near the fireplace, clutching an old photograph she no longer recognized. Ash curled immediately beside her feet. Bear walked instead toward Walter, then rested quietly against his leg. Walter froze. The old firefighter lowered one trembling hand into the puppy's fur very carefully, like touching hope itself might hurt too much if he held on tightly. And for the first time since the fire in Chicago, Walter Hayes looked like a man standing on the edge of surrender. The storm arrived again just after sunset, swallowing the Wyoming mountains beneath violent wind and endless snow, while the old cabin groaned like something exhausted from surviving too many winters. Inside, the atmosphere felt strangely fragile. Margaret sat near the fireplace wrapped in 3 blankets despite the heat, softly humming a lullaby she no longer remembered learning. Ash slept curled beside her slippers, one oversized paw twitching occasionally in dreams. Bear remained near Walter's chair as always now, lying quietly beneath the old firefighter's boots with watchful dark eyes. Walter had stopped pretending not to notice. Noah Brooks stood near the kitchen counter holding 2 folded leashes in one hand. The retired Marine looked more tired tonight than usual. Deep shadows rested beneath his gray eyes, and several days of rough stubble darkened his sharply angled jaw. Though only 38, Noah carried the emotional stillness of someone who had already attended too many funerals too young. War had trained patience into him, but loneliness had sharpened it. Rex rested near the doorway beside him, old amber eyes tracking every movement inside the cabin. Claire leaned quietly against the sink watching Walter. Nobody wanted to start the conversation, which meant it eventually became Walter who did. You should take them tonight, he muttered roughly without looking up. Margaret stopped humming immediately. The silence afterward hurt more than shouting would have. Noah frowned slightly. Walter, I mean it. Walter's weathered fingers tightened around the coffee mug in his hands. You've got space, training, stability. His voice lowered further. They deserve somebody who isn't falling apart. Margaret looked toward the puppies instantly. Fear crossed her face so quickly it almost looked childlike. But Walter, she whispered softly. Walter could not meet her eyes. That alone terrified Claire. Because men like Walter Hayes survived entire lifetimes by forcing themselves to face terrible things directly. Fires, death, trauma, coffins. Yet now he stared only at the floor, as if looking at his wife's pain might finally destroy whatever strength he still had left. Outside, snow slammed against the windows hard enough to shake the glass. Noah crouched slowly beside Ash first. The smaller Labrador immediately licked his hand and wagged his tail with blind puppy optimism. Noah clipped the leash gently onto Ash's collar. Easy. Simple. Then he reached toward Bear. The larger puppy instantly backed away. Not aggressively. Fearfully. Bear pressed himself tighter against Walter's chair. Walter inhaled sharply. Bear, he muttered softly. Come on, boy. But the puppy refused to move. Rex slowly lifted his head nearby, ears twitching with quiet attention. Noah tried again carefully, lowering his voice the way soldiers learned to calm frightened animals overseas. It's okay, buddy. Bear's eyes remained fixed entirely on Walter. Then something unexpected happened. The puppy walked directly beneath Walter's trembling hand and pressed his small body against the old firefighter's leg. Walter froze. The room did too. Bear looked upward with heartbreaking trust, tail wagging once very slowly while snowstorm shadows moved across the cabin walls behind them. Walter's hand lowered uncertainly into the puppy's black fur, and suddenly his breathing became uneven. Claire recognized it immediately. Not anger, not panic, grief. Raw grief finally breaking through decades of emotional concrete. Walter bowed his head lower. I can't do this again, he whispered. Nobody moved. The old firefighter's shoulders began trembling beneath his flannel shirt. Years of smoke, funerals, and buried trauma cracked open all at once inside that tiny freezing cabin. When my daughter died, Walter's voice broke hard enough to barely remain words anymore. I cleaned out her room the next morning because I thought if I kept moving, maybe it wouldn't hurt as bad. He laughed bitterly beneath his breath. But empty houses don't stay quiet. His rough fingers tightened gently into Bear's fur. They scream at night. Margaret covered her mouth silently as tears filled her fading green eyes. Noah looked away toward the storm outside. Claire felt her own throat tighten painfully. Walter finally lifted his head slightly. For the first time since Noah met him, the old firefighter no longer looked frightening or emotionally distant. He looked terrified. Terrified of losing Margaret. Terrified of watching her disappear piece by piece. Terrified that one day this cabin would become silent except for his own breathing. And most of all, terrified of surviving longer than the people he loved. Bear slowly climbed awkwardly into Walter's lap despite already growing too large for it. The puppy rested his heavy head against Walter's chest. Walter completely fell apart after that. No loud sobbing. Just silent tears disappearing into gray beard while one trembling hand held the dog close against him like the last living thing, keeping him tied to the world. Margaret rose slowly from the couch and crossed the room carefully. Her memory might have been fading, but love had not. She rested one small, weathered hand against Walter's cheek gently enough to feel holy. You're not alone, sweetheart, she whispered softly. Walter closed his eyes immediately. Outside, winter buried the mountains beneath darkness. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, Walter Hayes finally stopped pretending he was strong enough to survive loneliness by himself. Spring arrived quietly in Pine Ridge. Snow melted slowly from the mountainsides while narrow rivers of icy water rushed through the forest like the world itself was waking after a long, painful sleep. The cabin no longer felt as cold as it once had. Not because life had become easier, because loneliness had finally begun loosening its grip inside those old wooden walls. Walter Hayes stood outside near the porch steps, splitting firewood beneath pale morning sunlight. At 74, every swing of the axe looked heavier now. Arthritis stiffened his scarred hands each morning, and the old shoulder injury from decades inside burning buildings often forced him to stop and breathe through pain. Yet something about him had changed over the winter. The anger inside him no longer burned as loudly. Bear sat nearby watching Walter with complete devotion. The Labrador puppy had nearly doubled in size by spring, his black coat thick and glossy beneath the sunlight. Though still young, Bear already carried the calm protective instincts of an older dog. He followed Walter everywhere now. To the woodshed, to the mailbox, even beside the bed during nightmares. Walter secretly depended on that more than he would ever admit aloud. Inside the cabin, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, slowly brushing Ash's fur, while soft country music drifted through an old radio near the sink. Ash remained the gentler puppy, affectionate with everyone, constantly pressing against people as if convinced love alone could repair broken things. Margaret smiled softly while brushing him. Then her expression changed. Confusion again. The brush stopped moving in her hand. She looked around the kitchen slowly, almost frightened. "Excuse me," she whispered quietly toward nobody in particular. "Where am I?" The question struck Walter harder than any nightmare ever had. He entered the kitchen immediately, setting the firewood down beside the door. "You're home, Maggie." Margaret stared at him uncertainly. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then came the question Walter had feared for months. "Do I know you?" The room became completely silent except for the faint crackling of bacon grease from the stove. Walter felt something inside his chest collapse quietly. Margaret's green eyes still looked warm, still gentle, but there was no recognition inside them anymore. Only polite confusion, like meeting a kind stranger at church. Bear walked immediately toward Walter and leaned against his leg. Ash climbed awkwardly into Margaret's lap. Instinctively, almost protectively, Walter forced himself to kneel beside her chair slowly. His gray beard looked thinner lately, and spring sunlight revealed how deeply exhaustion had carved itself into his weathered face. But his voice remained soft. "My name is Walter," he whispered carefully. "I'm your husband." Margaret blinked several times. Then something heartbreaking happened. She smiled apologetically. "Oh," she said gently. "You seem very nice." Walter looked away instantly before she could see tears filling his eyes. Outside, Noah Brooks stood near his truck holding bags of groceries beside Claire Donovan. Neither of them moved after hearing the conversation through the open screen door. Claire quietly lowered her eyes. Noah stared toward the mountains instead. Some grief felt too private to witness directly. Later that afternoon, Margaret wandered outside into the field behind the cabin wearing only slippers against the cold mud. Noah found her standing beside the old fence, staring at wildflowers growing through melting snow. "You waiting for someone?" Noah asked softly. Margaret looked toward him with faint uncertainty. "There was a man," she whispered slowly. "Tall, strong shoulders, smelled like smoke and winter air." Her brow furrowed gently. "I think I loved him." Noah's throat tightened painfully. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "You still do." Margaret smiled softly at that. Even with memories disappearing, emotion still remained somewhere deep inside her heart. That evening, Claire cooked dinner inside the cabin, while Noah repaired part of the porch railing Walter had ignored all winter. For the first time in years, voices filled the house again. Laughter too. Small laughter. Fragile laughter. But alive. Walter sat quietly beside the fireplace watching Margaret stroke Ash's ears while Bear rested at his boots. The old firefighter finally understood something then. Love was never stored entirely inside memory. If it were, dogs would forget their people after every storm. If it were, wounded soldiers would never find their way home. If it were, Margaret would feel nothing at all when she looked at him now. Yet somehow, even after forgetting his name, she still relaxed whenever he entered the room. She still smiled when he touched her hand. And every night before falling asleep, she still whispered softly toward the empty darkness beside her pillow. "Good night, Walter." Sometimes she remembered him for only seconds. Sometimes not at all. But those small moments became enough. Outside, spring wind moved gently through the Wyoming mountains while the last snow melted into rivers beneath the fading sunset. And inside the old cabin, Walter Hayes finally learned that loving someone was not about holding on forever. Sometimes love meant staying, even while the person you loved slowly drifted beyond your reach. Sometimes, God does not heal people the way we pray for. Sometimes He does not erase the pain, restore every memory, or turn back time the way we desperately wish He would. But sometimes, He sends small miracles instead. A loyal dog that refuses to leave someone alone. A stranger who arrives exactly when a broken family needs help. A quiet moment beside the person you love before the memory fades again. And sometimes, the miracle is simply having the strength to keep loving even when your heart knows loss is coming. Walter spent years believing strength meant surviving everything by himself. But in the end, God reminded him that healing often begins when we finally allow others to stay beside us through the storm. In everyday life, many people around us are fighting silent battles nobody can see. Some are carrying grief. Some are caring for loved ones slowly disappearing to illness. Some smile in public while falling apart in private. That is why kindness matters more than we realize. A phone call matters. Checking on your parents matters. Sitting beside someone during their darkest season matters. And maybe today, God is using you to become somebody else's reason to keep going. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what moment moved you the most. And if you enjoy emotional stories about faith, love, loyalty, healing, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story. May God bless you and your family. May He heal every hidden wound inside your heart, bring peace to your home, and guide you safely through every storm life places before you. And may you never forget, even when memories fade, real love never truly leaves us.